my shorts.
We had quite a bit of interaction this week where people kind of weighed in. We had a little bit of a debate last week on a couple of things, and people weighed in, whether it be on Instagram or Twitter or sent me emails or comments or whatever.
It was a good topic.
It was a good topic. We were talking about what we should consider classic cinema, because it came to my attention recently that we are as far from the 1980s as the 1980s were from the 1940s.
Yep.
So essentially it's been 40 years since 1980.
Yeah.
Which really opens up this new can of worms about how people perceive cinema and what's considered classic cinema. So, like, for me, I could say Die Hard is a classic. It's a classic film,
Yep.
but I wouldn't consider it classic cinema. I don't think it belongs in the, like, that umbrella of classic cinema.
Mm-hmm.
Again, just semantics, and I think it's still confusing a few people.
Yeah, for sure.
But I can consider a movie classic. Oh, it's a classic film, but it's not classic cinema.
Yeah.
Anyway, I kind of asked, I said I'd like to hear from people, like particularly younger people. I mean, even people that are maybe like 10 years younger than me, like in their early 20s,
Yep.
how they perceive movies, because I'm hearing some people are like, I would consider movies from the 80s, 90s, maybe even early 2000s as classic cinema. So I was just kind of like, I want to know what people think about this. And I had quite a few people weigh in, actually. I've got Bobby Walsh wrote in. He said, I'm an '02 kid, and I consider 80s movies classics, but not really 90s, and definitely not early 2000s. Yeah.
Yep.
John the Movie Dude says, I would look at the golden age of cinema to maybe the very early 70s as classic cinema, which is kind of what I was saying last week. The 80s, 90s, and 2000s are separate things. They each have their own little quirks that make them special and different from each other, and this is coming from a kid born in the early 2000s. Fair enough. Mr. Rap Stevens says, I mean, I look at more recent movies like The Dark Knight and would call that a classic, so I reckon you can call 80s movies classic cinema if the film's good enough in your eyes.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I'd like to know what when he was born.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. The one that doesn't count, now this is huge. This is a massive thing.
That's the users.
The user's name is the one that doesn't count. It does count. All the opinions count. He says, or she says, when it comes to cataloguing films into eras, I look less to the actors in the films, which of course is still a perfectly valid way to look at this, but to look more at the technological advances. So this is kind of like what we were saying last week, that we kind of bunched them by like, Paul Newman's still at the heart of his game in the 70s. We could still consider that classic cinema.
Yeah. Because of him.
Because of him.
He was.
But then I kind of considered this week, Robert Redford is still acting and still doing really good stuff. So that kind of almost throws that out a little bit, maybe.
Yeah.
So he or she says...
maybe it's just a combination there.
Yeah, well, because then we did also talk about the technological aspects of it.
Yeah, that's right.
If you want to hear it, we fucking went on for like 30 minutes.
Yeah, that's right.
You can check it out on last week's pod. But we're throwing it over to the people at the moment. So anyway, the one that doesn't count, which does count, says, I would categorize them as vintage as the birth of cinema to the early 60s when colour films became dominant. Classic is the early 60s to 77. And modern classics is 77 to 99, and then modern is 99 to now. He says vintage is black and white, film was king. There's something about that era of cinema when there wasn't much colour that just feels so its own, and I feel that once you start and add colour in with these older films, it becomes a bit much for them to be considered basically the same.
Yep.
That's fair enough.
Very valid.
I chose to split the classic era in two. As much as I feel you could lump something like a Butch Cassidy with something like Back to the Future without there being much of a disconnect, but to ignore the complete and utter groundbreaking moment that is Star Wars, especially when I'm looking at these eras in terms of technological advancement, I feel would be a mistake. So I made the choice to split the classics into pure classics and modern classics, with Star Wars marking the change. And then he says modern cinema is designated by the release of The Phantom Menace, which ushered in the modern age of visual effects. And he says he thinks that's what sets modern films apart from something like Die Hard, like 80s and 90s films, I suppose. He says, at the end of the day, these are just the ramblings of an overtired 16-year-old at 1 a.m, so make of that what you will.
Yeah.
Very, very good, very well-written, articulate answer there.
Yeah.
So thank you for that one.
Really good way to look at it.
That in.
That was a really good way to look
nice to see some young film fans
exactly.
weighing in like this too.
Yeah.
I see myself that at that age probably saying something
Yeah,
like
exactly
that.
right. And knowing and just knowing what Butch Cassidy is. And
No, exactly right. That's great.
Back to the Future and stuff. So obviously got a good love of film and cinema and stuff. But no, that was a really good way to look at it, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really good.
And using Star Wars as the...
Yeah. Well, we kind of mentioned that last week, didn't we? We were like, no, that age of the blockbuster really... Yeah. That's why I look at like the classics goes up to the late 70s because you've got Star Wars and all those movies coming
Star Wars ushered in that whole new way of making films, and it was an incredibly regardless of what you think of the film. It was an incredibly groundbreaking film because of the way they had to make the film and what they had to create to be able to make the film.
Yeah. Pulp Serial also wrote in, another long-time listener and viewer of the channel.
Yep.
Says, this is how I break down the cinema timeline. Now, this is a guy that loves his classic stuff. He loves his classic, like, serials and all that kind of shit. So
You've probably had discussions with him over this before.
I have. Well, sort of. Yeah, I've talked to him about stuff like this quite a bit. Actually, I'm going to go on his podcast. I keep having to message him like, I'm so sorry, I've been so busy. We'll get it organised soon. Yeah, exactly. But it will happen, and I've said it now on this podcast, so it's going to happen.
Yep.
He does a couple of really great podcasts where he talks about classic movies and stuff, and I always love to support that stuff because there's not too many people out there who like to champion this stuff. So anyway, he says he considers 1890s to the 60s as classic film era, late 60s to 1980s as new Hollywood. Yeah, so that's when you get the ushering in of that next wave, which is the Paul Newmans and the Robert Redfords and Jane Fondas, etc. 1980 to present day is the modern era. And I think this is probably the one that I would go with the most.
Yeah.
I feel.
Yeah.
I feel like I always lump, like, what he's saying here is the classic film era with New Hollywood. I always lump them into one. But it does make sense to break it up like that. Because you do have that classic, which is Bogarts and Bacalls and, Boris Karloff and all them. Early cinema, Charlie Chaplin. And then the New Hollywood is your Paul Newmans, etc. And then modern era, 1980s, where you got the Brat Pack coming in.
Yeah.
Pitt and Clooney and Roberts and all them.
Yeah, it's pretty good. I mean, the New Hollywood you could probably take further into the 80s maybe.
Yeah, I reckon.
Probably 60s to 90s, I would think maybe.
Yeah, because I still feel like even though Robert Redford's still making movies now, I feel like that's like the height of their career where they're doing... Yeah. They're still at like that 80s where they're still doing really, really good movies. Yeah. Paul Newman and all that.
Most of their stuff in the 60s and 70s.
60s, 70s. But then the 80s, they're still doing some really
good stuff.
And then
you got like, Clooney and Pitt and all those. They didn't really come in, they weren't really big until
the 90s,
early 90s. Yeah. So I'd probably stretch that New Hollywood through to about the 90s.
You got to think about like Tom Cruise, Rob, what's his name?
Schneider.
Not Rob Schneider, no. Rob, oh man, I read his book.
Yeah.
He was on Ally McBeal. Was he on Ally McBeal?
Yeah.
The West Wing. Rob. Shit. No. Anyway, they have all started to come in the 1980s, that 80s period, because they were all quite young. And Matthew Broderick.
Yeah, probably mid 80s because things like Risky Business, what was that? That was mid 80s.
80s, yeah, and Days of Thunder,
Top Gun, and
all
that sort of stuff. So yeah, he's probably.
And then like your Ferris Bueller's and. It's just, you could really lump cinema into the decades, really. Each decade is so...
Well, it's a generational thing.
Yeah, exactly.
When you think about it.
So again, at the end of the day, you're really just trying to slap a label on something. Rob. Fucking hell. It's doing my head in now. I have to look
He had that bloody sex tape.
Yeah, he did too.
Didn't he?
Oh, my God. Rob Lowe.
Rob Lowe. That's... God.
Yeah.
How could we forget Rob
Lowe. There you go. Oh, I love him. I think he's great.
Oh, it's awesome.
I read his book. It was very good. Anyway, so people weighed in on that. We were also talking about The Simpsons last week, and I said that I think there are more shit episodes than good ones.
Well, yeah. Let's if you're looking at that, like
what?
In like the 80s and stuff, where Rob Lowe and all that stuff. What about Robert Downey?
Yeah, but that's that same wave. That's exactly the same wave of actor because they all came up together. But Rob Lowe, Robert Downey Jr.,
but then
Tom Cruise.
He faded out because of all his legal issues and stuff, and then he came back with Iron Man and stuff like that. So does he fit into 2 eras?
It's about the same. But how many of these people kind of disappear and then come back?
Yeah, but not as dramatically as that. There's not many. When you think about it.
I don't know.
Because he had a massive falling out.
Yeah, I know. I don't know.
And he owned it. He owns it.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, but he did come up in because they all came through together in the Outsiders. That film, Francis Ford Coppola had Robert Downey Jr., Rob Lowe. You had Tom Cruise,
River Phoenix.
All them were all coming in together as this group. Were they the Brat Pack?
I think they were, weren't they?
Yeah.
Pitt and...
No, see, not Brad Pitt and Clooney. That's a separate thing.
Yeah.
You have the Rat Pack, which is...
Yeah, I think you're right. I think they were known as the Brat Pack.
Rat Pack. I'm going to look it up. Because I know there was a name, Brat Pack. The Brat Pack, nickname given to a group of young Generation X actors who frequently appeared together. Emilio Estevez, Anthony Michael Hall, Rob Lowe, Andrew McCarthy, Demi Moore, Judd Nelson, Molly Ringwald, Ali Sheedy. Then you get Tom Cruise, all that sort of came up together as well. Charlie Sheen.
Yeah.
So what was Clooney, Pitt, Pack? Because they had a name as well. Rat Pack? No, I don't know. Modern day Rat Pack. No, maybe they didn't actually have a... Yeah, and then you got Ben Affleck and Damon and all them.
I think they might have been compared to the Rat Pack because of Ocean's
11. That is probably it. Yeah. Anyway, let's move on from this because we banged on about it last week. Hey everyone, if you haven't yet, smash that big old subscribe button up on your screen to keep up to date with all my content and hit that like button down below. Also, don't forget to check me out on social media and please consider supporting me over on Patreon for as little as $1 a month for exclusive videos, early access content and to get your name up on the screen. Thanks again for watching.